The behavioral finance perspective. First, let's quickly understand the difference between traditional finance and behavioral finance. Traditional finance describes how investors should behave, whereas behavioral finance tries to explain how investors actually behave. In traditional finance, investors are assumed to have perfect information, and we also assume that investors process the information in an unbiased manner. So perfect information and almost perfect processing. Whereas in behavioral finance, investors operate based on bounded rationality. They try to satisfy. This is a combination of satisfy and suffice. Investors also exhibit both cognitive and emotional biases. In traditional finance, investors are risk averse and they will always reject gambles with non-positive expected return. Whereas in behavioral finance, investors are not consistently risk averse. At times, people do take gambles with non-positive expected return. In traditional finance, we have the expected utility theory, and the counterpart in behavioral finance is the prospect theory. In traditional finance, we assume that markets are efficient, whereas in behavioral finance, markets are not necessarily efficient, and the theory that we look at is the adaptive market hypothesis. In traditional finance, portfolios are mean variance optimized, whereas in behavioral finance, investors might separate their portfolios in layers in order to satisfy their goals. Coming now to traditional finance and expected utility theory. Traditional finance assumes that individuals are perfectly rational, risk-averse, and self-interested. They have perfect information and update probability calculations using the Bayes formula. The expected utility theory indicates how people should make decisions. The objective is to make an optimal decision. In other words, the best possible decision which maximizes long-term expected utility. Individuals maximize expected utility at a given level of risk. The expected utility might vary from person to person, but the utility increases at a decreasing rate with higher levels of wealth. So if we were to plot the utility function according to traditional finance, where we have wealth on the horizontal axis and utility on the vertical axis, then this will be a concave utility function. So notice, as wealth increases, utility increases, but at a decreasing rate. A term frequently used in the context of traditional finance is REM, or rational economic man. A rational economic man will try to obtain the highest possible economic well-being or utility given budget constraints and the available information about opportunities, and he will base his choices only on the consideration of his own personal utility. Now here is a statement that indicates what a rational economic man might say. So if somebody says, I have always followed a budget and have been a disciplined saver for decades, even in hard times when I had to reduce my usual discretionary spending, I always managed to save. So this is something that a rational economic man would say. Now, coming to the behavioral finance perspective, specifically the attitude to risk. According to behavioral finance, individuals are not consistently risk averse. The level of risk individuals are willing to take depends on circumstances and level of wealth. The curvature of the utility function can change. So now if we consider the utility function where we have wealth on the x-axis, utility on the y-axis, we can have a situation like this where an individual is risk averse for a certain level of wealth, and then an individual might actually become risk seeking and potentially at very high levels of wealth risk averse again. People make low probability high risk payoffs, and the example is lottery tickets, or some investors might buy out of the money options with a negative expected value. So this is where people are taking low probability high risk payoffs. But at the same time, people will buy insurance, where they are insuring themselves against low risks, and these insurance policies have a low payoff. Examples would be flight insurance or earthquake insurance. So notice that people do exhibit both risk-seeking and risk-averse behavior. People tend to be risk-seeking for gains and risk-averse for losses. The utility function that I showed over here is called the Friedman-Savage double inflection utility function. This is a utility function that changes based on levels of wealth. And here we have two inflection points. One inflection point is over here. And at high levels of wealth, we are going from risk-seeking to risk-averse. So this is another inflection point. A question like this has shown up in the past, where we are told about an investor who buys out of the money options knowing that the expected value is negative. So the investor is exhibiting risk-seeking behavior. At the same time, the investor buys insurance where she is demonstrating risk-averse behavior. So we are asked to show the utility function or describe the utility function, and this is what that question deals with. Coming now to prospect theory. This is one of the theories that falls under behavioral finance. Prospect theory is an alternative to expected utility theory and is based on how decisions are actually made. It assigns values to gains and losses or changes in wealth rather than to absolute wealth. So in that sense, this is a little different from the utility function. In the utility function, we look at wealth on the x-axis, whereas with prospect theory, we look at gains and losses. People often overweight low probability outcomes and underweight moderate or high probability outcomes. And the implication is that people will then be risk averse when there is a high probability of gains or a low probability of losses, and people will be risk seeking when there is a low probability of gains or a high probability of losses. The value function is based on deviations from a reference point. So if this is our reference point, we have gains on the right, losses on the left, then the value function might look something like this. So for gains, this is risk averse or concave, and for losses, this is risk seeking or convex. Also, in prospect theory, we assume that individuals are loss averse. Now, loss aversion refers to a situation where investors dislike losses more than they like gains. Prospect theory explains why people simultaneously buy lottery tickets and insurance while investing money conservatively. Now, here is a statement that somebody following prospect theory might make. So if somebody says, when considering investments, I have always liked using long option positions. I like their risk return trade-offs. My personal estimates of the probability of gains seem to be higher than that implied by market prices. So what this person is doing is overweighting low probability outcomes. I am not sure how to explain that, but to me long options provide tremendous upside potential with little risk given the low probability of limited losses. Now here the investor is underweighting moderate to high probability outcomes. So this investor is clearly exhibiting the points related to prospect theory. Another important concept in behavioral finance is bounded rationality. People don't necessarily optimize because the cost might be too high. Also, there are limitations to knowledge and cognitive capacity. The bounded rationality theory recognizes that people are not fully rational when making decisions. Instead, people satisfice, and satisfice is a combination of satisfy plus suffice. The outcomes might not be optimal, but they are likely to be adequate or sufficient. Decisions are based on a limited set of important factors and or heuristics. Heuristics are mental shortcuts or rules of thumb. Now, here are some examples from past papers or from the curriculum. If we have a 60-year-old who is investing 60% of his portfolio in fixed income based on the rule of thumb that the allocation to fixed income should be equal to age. So He is not necessarily doing what is 100% optimal, but is following a reasonably sensible strategy. So this person is satisficing. If I stick with my existing asset management company because it meets my basic requirements, then again I am following bounded rationality. I am satisficing because there might be better options out there, but I am sticking with something that seems reasonably good. If you look at the curriculum example 2, we have an individual who is depositing funds in a checking account at a bank down the street. The bank is FDIC insured and offers a competitive rate. So basically this person is looking for a bank where his deposits are insured. He also wants a reasonable rate. Now, rather than looking at every possible bank in the city, he goes with the bank down the street that seems good enough. When new information on a company becomes available, I adjust my expectations for that company stock based on past experiences with similar information. Now here again, this person is not looking at all possible information. He is looking at a reasonable subset to update his decision. The downside of bounded rationality is that better alternatives might be missed. Coming now to the perspective on market behavior. In traditional finance, we assume that markets are efficient, that the price is right, which means that all securities are properly priced and there are no arbitrage opportunities. With behavioral finance, we recognize that markets are not necessarily efficient and anomalies do exist. So here is a statement from somebody who believes that the market is not entirely efficient. So this is a behavioral finance perspective. While I try to make decisions analytically, I do believe that markets can be driven by the emotions of others. So I have frequently used buy-sell signals when investing. Also, my 20 years of experience with managers who actively trade on such information makes me think they are worth the fees they charge. Now, the market theory related to behavioral finance is the adaptive market hypothesis, and the major implications of this hypothesis are shown over here. One is that risk premiums change over time. 2, active management can add value by exploiting arbitrage opportunities. Any particular investment strategy will not be successful on a consistent basis. The ability to adapt and innovate is critical for survival, and survival is the essential objective. Traditional and behavioral perspectives on portfolio construction. So with traditional portfolio theory, we assume that an individual is rational. So we have a rational economic man. The rational economic man uses self-control to pursue long-term goals rather than short-term satisfaction, considers risk-return objectives and constraints, uses mean variance optimization, and considers different sources of money or wealth to be fungible. Fungible means easily interchangeable. Now here are some statements from past papers which suggest behavioral portfolio theory. Client exhibits self-control bias by spending all of her current salary income and half her bonus income on current consumption, pursuing short-term satisfaction to the detriment of long-term financial security. So if somebody is doing this, they are clearly not acting like a rational economic man, because this is what a rational economic man will do. Here this person is focusing more on short-term satisfaction. A behavioral portfolio theory investor maximizes expected wealth subject to a safety constraint. As a result, the optimal portfolio of a BPT investor is a combination of bonds or riskless assets and highly speculative assets. In BPT, portfolios often exhibit a mental accounting bias, which is where investors have different mental accounts based on the source and or the use of money. The portfolio is constructed in layers, and the layers are current income, currently owned assets, and money from current income is generally spent on consumption. The returns from currently owned assets are partially spent on current consumption, and then we have the present value of future income, and very little of this money is spent on current consumption. The final slide now from this reading, I'll just give you some examples of traditional finance versus behavioral portfolio theory. My client likes to match their goals with specific investment allocations or layers of their portfolio. So this is an example of behavioral portfolio theory, and the client is exhibiting mental accounting. I follow a disciplined approach to investing. When a stock has appreciated by 15%, I sell it. Also, I sell a stock when its price has declined by 25% from my initial purchase price. So this again is behavioral portfolio theory. The client does not like losses and lets the stock fall by 25% before he sells it. On the other hand, if there is a gain of 15%, the investor locks in the gain. So this is an example of loss aversion. It is also something that we see in prospect theory. Overall, I have always been willing to take a small chance of losing up to 8% of the portfolio annually. I can accept any asset classes to meet my financial goals if this constraint is considered. So the investor is doing mean variance optimization. And if we look at this quantification, where an acceptable portfolio will satisfy the following condition, where we have expected return, expected standard deviation. So here again, this emphasizes that the client is doing mean variance optimization. That is it for this reading.